I've come to believe that we're faced with life lessons.
Yeah.
I think potentially at some point I may have signed up for this life. It's hard for me to imagine that I would say, I want to become a bereaved mother. I do believe that he wasn't meant to be here always, and I believe that the lesson that was affiliated with his addiction and growing up with addiction every which way is related to powerlessness
Sure.
and recognizing that we are essentially powerless over just about everything, aside from loving the people that we can.
So this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and we are live on YouTube, and then this becomes a podcast and does all sorts of things and lasts forever on the interwebs. My guest is Sally McQuillan. How do you say your last name properly?
It's Sally McQuillan.
McQuillan. Okay. Yeah, once I get it down. And Sally is a psychotherapist in private practice specializing in addiction, recovery, grief, and trauma and healing. She is the author of Reaching for Beautiful, a memoir of loving and losing a wild child, which I just finished reading this morning, and I have a tons of notes I want to talk to you about. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, as I said, and I'm asking you to please subscribe to my YouTube channel that this is on, and also subscribe right now to my Spotify and Apple Podcasts channels if you're listening there, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, which is a commentary page at Substack at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Okay, now we will get back to the book. So let me just start by telling people a little bit who you are. And I'm reading this from whatever, Sally is, I'm terrible with acronyms. LCSWCADC. What is that?
Yes, I'm a licensed clinical social worker,
Yeah.
and I also have a certification in addiction.
Okay.
That's the CADC.
All right. Well, I'm bad on that kind of thing. Is a psychotherapist in private practice specializing in addiction, grief, and trauma and recovery, an avid reader with a double major in writing and dance. Criticism in college. I'm going to ask you what dance criticism is. She began working in public relations and marketing prior to obtaining her master's degree in social work. Reaching for Beautiful is Sally's first book. She and her husband live on the North Shore of Chicago, where they raise their three children. And then the pitch that your publisher has is interesting here because she says for fans of Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking or David Sheff's Beautiful Boy, this debut memoir about a mother grieving her adult son's death is a must read for any parent who has lost a child or whose child struggles with addiction. So there's sort of a double whammy here because there's the addiction issue, and that is something you're still working on professionally with people. And then there is the grief issue. And your book, is about both in the sense that it's a memoir about your own experience. But of course, in that memoir, you're making a point about grief and addiction. And so that it's a kind of a double whammy. And I've chosen some things to read back to you and talk about out of the book, out of any sequence. So I'm not looking particularly at page numbers here. Whenever I think about leaving the house, I experience dread. My son left the house, and now I don't want to. I forget Chris isn't here. And I kind of open with that because to me, that captured the poignancy of your story.
It did indeed. The social anxiety that I developed as a result of the trauma of unexpectedly losing my beautiful 21-year-old boy,
Yeah.
it manifested in that way. I didn't feel safe any
Yeah.
longer.
Yeah.
And
And I empathize with that very much because in a much smaller scale, because he came back alive. My son John went off to fight in Afghanistan at the beginning of that war, and he did two combat tours and um, then another one in Iraq. And that was at the beginning of the war. And there was a time when, during the time he was deployed, I would become terrified every time I would hear the crunch of a tire on my gravel driveway wondering if
Mhm.
this was the time the two guys would show up in dress blue uniforms in a van and tell me my son was dead. So the postal van and friends visiting were a threat. And I didn't dare look out the living room window for about a year and a half in case it was what I feared most. So I kind of huddled indoors. So I understand that's not fear coming from a loss, but that's the fear of loss. So that line resonated with me because
Really?
in
Oh,
another context, which had a happy ending, and
yes.
so I didn't get to where you got, but I understand the first part, the huddle indoors. Why would I go outside with this happening to my son out there somewhere?
Right. There was something so poignant about, and I do think that there was an added layer of trauma in that my son had actually solicited my opinion, which was unusual for him,
I
and
remember in the
asked
book.
me about whether or not he should go to his friend's lake house or go into the city to continue partying after New Year's Eve at the
Sure.
bars. And so I had thought to myself that the idea of going to a lake house with a bunch of guys and hanging out was going
Mhm.
to be the more benign.
Yeah.
And so the fact that and whether he really I mean, he ended up going that route, but, my brother reassured me that he never listened to much of what I had to say anyway. So that was
Yeah.
just the way it, but I think that another component of the trauma of losing him was the guilt.
Yeah.
And so that kind of made for his departure,
Sure.
um, kind of cutting through my heart like a knife. And
Yeah.
it's funny, Frank, when you shared that story, I can't believe it, but I would say about 2 weeks ago, I
Mm.
was sitting right here in my office and I could look here and see a police car pulling up and its lights were going.
Sure.
And then my doorbell rang. I was
Yeah.
in the middle of a session with a client and she said, "Are you okay?" I don't know what my face must have done.
Yeah.
I think my heart dropped. And I said, "I'm going to have to call you back." And, lo and behold, they didn't realize that they had, mildly terrorized me
Sure.
by doing some sort of investigation about something that had happened down the street. But
Yeah. Not to mention triggering everything in you.
that's exactly right. These triggers are so powerful, and they are a
Mm.
part of whether it's fear and anticipation of loss or of having lost.
Yeah, and I want to get into the story and the addiction and the loss and the timeline. And I think it's been what, about 7 years since this all happened, or 7 years before you wrote the book, or am I getting that wrong?
It took me 7 years to write it, and it has
Yeah.
now actually been 9 years since
Okay,
he
because you were
passed.
writing and then it got published and so forth. And the book came out this year, I believe.
Yes, April 1st, so very
Yeah.
recently.
So hey, good. All right, we're on top of that. So I'm going to roll way back before I dive into the book. When I get to know somebody, at some point, I want to know who they are, and they want to know who I am. And I always start with how I was raised, who my parents were, that I was put in a boarding school in England. I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. I've been married to her for 55 years, and so on. I'm
Mm.
never interested in the professional side of a person's life because that's not who they are. I mean, the fact that you've studied certain subjects is interesting and so on and so forth. So let me go way back because you've told a very personal story, which gives me the freedom to ask you some pretty personal questions. Tell me who your parents were and how you were raised. You're a religious, believing person now. That comes from somewhere. I'd like to know how you were raised in terms of a belief system, but more importantly, who were they? Did you get on with them? Do you get on with them? What's that background like for you? So, how were you formed to be the person who has this son and who now, for the last 9 years has been dealing with this grief? But I want to know before any of that started, where you come from.
Yes. Well, it's funny. We live here in Hubbard Woods, Winnetka, and my mother and stepfather actually grew up in Hubbard Woods. They went to the same elementary school that my children went on to attend.
Yeah,
And I actually thought that I would be the last person who would return to my hometown. I thought I was more of a California girl, a little bit of a misfit, so to speak.
yeah,
Um, and yet I've got these roots, my grandparents having settled
sure.
and moved here just down the street from me, actually,
Mm,
their first rental home. My mother was a young, naive, very nurturing, caretaking preschool teacher.
mm,
And my father was an only child who came up. He grew up in Evanston, which is not far from here.
sure. I know where it is.
And
Yeah.
they met when my mother was attending Smith and my father attending Amherst, and fell in love. And at that time, um, were seemingly a match made in heaven, but at the same time, I know that my grandfather had reservations about my father even then because he was um, a little bit wild.
Mm,
So my mother was marrying someone from a sort of different socioeconomic place, and they were. This is sort of funny. I was born May 11th, 1963. They were married August 11th, 1962.
okay.
So they were quite young, and there I was
How old were they when they got married?
immediately. They were 21, and my mother had me at 22.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So there was that kind of youth factor and kind of coming together of similar backgrounds but different backgrounds. And there was my mother's caretaking and my father's charm and personality.
Hmm.
So that kind of lays the groundwork. Someone said this recently, I was an accident and I was,
What kind of parents do you remember as a young child? What's always interesting to me is that my parents, when I was very young, were one sort of people. And then as I got older, they transformed themselves into other sorts of people. And of course, we all grow and change. But how would you, in a thumbnail, because we want to get to this book, but it's to do with the book, describe the arc of your own childhood? Like who were they through it?
yes, as a firstborn, I would say that that was an impactful piece of it. As a girl, I would say that my father was misogynistic, and so he was not thrilled about my arrival,
Hmm.
nor that I was a girl. And that set a bit of a tone. I would say that my mom was lovely. Her license plate says happier. She
Yeah.
operates in a wonderful state of this window in which things are essentially always well.
Hmm.
And my father was volatile and alcoholic, but we didn't know it at the time. I just knew that he was someone that I feared and that I detected early on because I was so sensitive. He didn't know how to demonstrate any kind of love and affection.
Yeah. And how does that story end with him and your mom? And
Well, they
like
ultimately get divorced, and of
yeah,
course, Sally, who's 11 or 12 at the time that they separate, intellectually assesses the situation and says, "Oh, this makes perfect sense. You two should
yeah.
not be together. This is in our best interest."
So were you kind of a church-going family? Did people, because you're pretty evangelical now, when I read your book, you come from that place now, and I'm just wondering, is this an add-on to who you were and a kind of a conversion experience at some point, or is this sort of okay, I was always raised this way?
We attended church, but I usually fought it. We went there largely to hear my mother sing in the choir because she
Yeah.
loved to do that. Um, and I did not necessarily, I believed in God, but
Mm.
it wasn't until I was 25 and I got sober that I was introduced to a spiritual program for living,
Yeah.
during which I could sort of take what I wanted and leave the rest, that I could
Yeah.
begin to form a definition of my own higher power,
Hmm.
which has since changed over time, especially with the loss of Christopher. He's almost become, not almost, he has become a conduit
Yeah.
to a power in the universe for me.
Yeah. Now, would you, if someone, we're talking a 10-second plane conversation here where you decide to, tell somebody exactly who you are. I sort of describe myself as an atheist who prays. In other words, I'm a shitty atheist, but I have a certain kind of background that my mind works in a certain direction, and that's who I am. So, deal with it. Um, how would you, in the thumbnail, sort of place yourself on the map, the sort of faith map? And by the way, since life is a journey, this only means who you are at 1:21 p.m. East Coast time today, and could be someplace else
Right.
tomorrow. And when you write your third or fourth book, you may be saying something completely different. So I don't want to hold you in anything, but I'm just interested in a snapshot before we dive into the book.
Having lost Christopher, things gelled for me, and I felt as if I was enlightened in the midst of the darkness of that.
Yeah,
And I feel as if currently, this moment, well, he led me to an additional spiritual course that I study.
sure.
And it's really essentially the message is one of the importance of love being all that really matters.
Yeah, here, here. Okay, so let me dive into the book. It's really about, there's two books here. One is the addiction story. So before we talk about Chris, you call him Chris in the book. So is it okay if I don't say Christopher?
You can say either. Yeah, most people would know him by Chris.
Okay, so we're going to go for Chris. Before we talk about Chris, let's just follow the arc of the addiction story through the family. Your dad, your experiences, his experiences, and how you now deal with this as a professional helping other people. And let's not get too bogged down because then we can't get to the real book, which is Chris, but I'm easing into it. Um, tell me the arc of your own thinking, personal experience, anecdotal experience, what you tell people. Give me a thumbnail on addiction. And if you want to tie it into the addiction crisis, that is conflicting our whole country on so many levels, you can do that too. So I'm not making any ground rules here, but let's just take this addiction. You've got this word love behind you in capital letters on your curtain rail. I want you to imagine the word addiction behind me in capital letters, and you can go anywhere you want with it. Let's talk about that first.
I've become so passionate about serving in this field, and
Mm.
I resisted that too. I was a daughter of an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic myself, and am married to a recovering alcoholic. I'm approaching 37 years during which I've been clean and sober, and then to have had children who struggle with addiction as well, because we didn't know then that there was such a powerful genetic
Sure,
component.
absolutely.
To be operating as a therapist, it was driven from my own recovery,
Hmm.
and then to serve the purpose in private practice of helping people who are in recovery and who are impacted by the addiction of other people is huge. It's
Yeah,
difficult. It's not. It's funny because I thought to myself, why am I doing this? This is, I'm so intimate. I had a recent conversation with somebody who said, what do you know about addiction? And I said, everything, I mean,
yeah,
it was sort of like, and I
sure.
want to be humble about it, but at the same time, um, it is a thread and a life lesson for me. And so
Yeah,
having that does come into reaching for beautiful, it's a tone. There's a fear factor in relationship to living with my father,
yeah.
and then discovering that my child was suffering from addiction as well, that it's something I had to work through.
Yeah. Would you say, and I know this is a brutal question, but your book is sort of brutal in a gentle way because you're telling hard things. If you look at that family history of addiction and you play it forward to Chris's life and then you lose him, do you, I don't know how to put this. Some bad things have happened in my life, and they are the playing forward of a kind of an evangelical background I grew up with that had a lot of guilt. If we didn't save the world, everybody would be lost. And it puts a tremendous burden. So it's no exaggeration for me to say, in one way, I don't think you ever grow past who you were in some way as a child, your fear of your father, in your case, my kind of background. So do you think that in some way, in your mind anyway, and maybe in fact too, that this kind of addiction environment you came from, struggled through, and so forth, leads directly into Chris's story in the sense that if you had to say, you know, if my son had died in Afghanistan, then it would have been George W. Bush combined with the war, combined with Al Qaeda, but with the war would have killed him, however you got there. But there's a history to why you're there. So do you see this history of addiction in your family as the kind of path that got Chris to where he was when you lost him in some way? And I know I've read the book, but I'm asking you to tell a little more rather than just reading people passing.
Yes, I actually really appreciate this question because I've come to believe that we're faced with life lessons.
Yeah,
I think potentially at some point I may have signed up for this life. It's hard for me to imagine that I would say, I want to become a bereaved mother.
right.
Um, but it's certainly when there's addiction, there's, in this case, it was not a direct result of the, opioid crisis, which
Sure.
is killing so many right now. And so there are so many mothers like myself who've lost children to that or to suicide or to accidents.
Yeah.
His addiction indirectly cost him, but his life. But I do believe that he wasn't meant to be here always. And I believe that the lesson that was affiliated with his addiction and growing up with addiction every which way is related to powerlessness
Sure.
and recognizing that we are essentially powerless over just about everything,
Mm.
aside from loving the people that we can.
Yeah.
And so that had a lot of when I was beginning to reconcile and surrender some control because I had to relinquish fear and
Mm.
just
Mm.
forge a relationship with my beautiful son where I wasn't chasing after him, where I was just simply being in a space of unconditional acceptance and sort
Sure.
of rejoicing in who he was,
Mm.
because who he was always who he was meant to be.
Mm.
And I wouldn't have wanted to actually rein him in.
Mm.
Um, that's where, to me, there's this beautiful traction. There's something about surrendering
Mm.
to that then empowers us to do things that make life worth living.
Mm. Let me just reintroduce. This is Frank Schaeffer in conversation with Frank Schaeffer on my podcast here. And I'm talking to Sally, who is the author of Reaching for Beautiful, a memoir of loving and losing a wild child. All right. So we've done a little bit on the addiction. Now, take a couple minutes here for the people who haven't read the book to just tell the Chris story: birth, life, death, reconnecting with him after death. And then I want to get into some of the substance of what I think the book is about. So just tell that story for the people who haven't read it.
That story
Um,
is that Christopher was my firstborn. He arrived in consistently a fast and furious, glorious way into the
mm,
world and had me. I developed a crush on him. Like, I don't know that. I'm sorry to my husband,
sure.
whom I also have a crush on. But this is, as most of us know, when we're first introduced to the love of a child, it's just, um, it's beyond. It's just miraculous and wonderful. And he had me challenged. So he was simultaneously someone I could not have loved more and
Yeah.
who I was also very challenged by. He
Yeah.
had numerous near death accidents even before he died. I did everything in my power to attempt to keep him safe because he was a kid who was so reckless and in the moment and never thinking about what would happen
Yeah.
next. He did have a period of sobriety, which was a sacred period during which we reconnected and really established a connection that then was sustained throughout the rest of his time here on Earth.
Yeah.
And he and three other boys, unfortunately, like any other 20, 21-year-old boys, simply thought it would be a good idea after parting to go out on a frozen lake. And
Yeah.
none of them survived. And so when he was 21, he was reported missing. And then I intuitively knew that he was already gone.
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't necessarily, having grown up as a Protestant, I heard about heaven, but I didn't have any sort of conviction about afterlife.
Yeah.
I was desperate with yearning and wondering where my son had gone.
Hmm.
So, a number of parts of Reaching for Beautiful um, are related to inside that yearning and
Yeah.
desperation and pain and what I and my seeking and the
Yeah.
signs and the mediums who helped validate that his spirit is still with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Good thumbnail sketch. Thank you for doing that because it saves me trying to tell you about your book, which is always embarrassing. I'd rather have you tell me the story.
Oh, I love to hear your thoughts.
Okay,
So,
well, you're about to, and it's all good. No, no fear here. I am going to dive into the book and do some things here. So I am going to read you quotes, but I'm going to set them up with what I want to talk about. So my first note to myself is this. Let's start with how people deal with other people's grief. And then I have a couple bulleted points, all of which are taken from your book. Okay. And so I'm going to read them and it's going to be a little bit long, not too long, take a minute or so. So, quote one is nobody prepares you as a grieving parent for all the things you can expect to hear that will tear at your soul. And it factors into my not wanting to leave the house. I never feel prepared for how it's going to go out in the world any more than I was prepared to lose him. That's quote one. Quote two from the next page, I think. Then unexpectedly, two women who are acquaintances from my community literally pulled away when they saw me. One, barely able to look me in the eye, rushed into another room and whispered to a friend. The other was clearly uncomfortable, but tried to make small talk about how we both had great taste in handbags, taxing me to respond on a level so different than the one I'm in. She too couldn't get away from me fast enough, as if losing a child is contagious. I love that line, as if losing a child is contagious. It felt like someone left the door open and cold air blew in. The next quote, I don't know how to relate to people anymore. I used to be so outgoing, but now I'm anything but. I have got to develop a thicker skin and remember that people have good intentions. Already acquaintances have made some faux pas in their attempts to connect. Expressions like, I can't imagine, that must be so awful, or that's every mother's worst nightmare, feel dismissive, like we are stating the obvious, and it is the fastest way to make me feel more alone. It's hardest when there is an underlying emphasis on, I pity you. I get it. The death of a child makes people feel so powerless and afraid that they are just trying to make sense of a reality too tough to digest. So those are three quotes from three parts of your book that kind of tell a story. You can explain the context if you want, but the big thing is just how you weave those together into your story now and then sort of bring it up into the present tense. Because I think those paragraphs all make such an excellent point about suffering, but also that a lot of that suffering is in the context of interaction with other people that's unavoidable unless you're just going to hide in your house and pull the curtains. So talk about that a little bit.
that's right. That's right. Um, it You brought it back to me, and being someone who's sensitive, unlike my husband, who'll say, I don't really care so much what people think. I even had an experience. We were out at a friend's book gathering. She's just launched her book, and I saw some folks from the community, one of whom recognized me, and I could literally experience the dawning in her eyes of seeing me and thinking about, because you immediately make that association. This is a mother I know, this is a woman I know who lost her child.
Yeah,
And I could see what instinctively happens. There's a sort of a pulling back. So, as someone who wants to be loved and accepted, to experience that little sort of energetic shift in someone
yeah,
really contributed to what is a pre-existing alienation to begin with. Anyone who's grieving might feel alone, and certainly grieving the loss of a child representing most parents' greatest fear.
sure.
It really made it contributed to my social anxiety, and it was harder for me then to get out. But ultimately, I believe so much in breaking through that, in really celebrating the part of me that knows, as I said there, I get it. I
Mm,
understand. I've even done it to other mothers who've lost a child before the point
sure.
at which I lost mine.
Yeah,
It's understandable, but part of these conversations that I'm having now, in, as Reaching for Beautiful gets out into the world, are designed to kind of promote a destigmatization of this, because there's so
yeah,
many of us that are in this boat,
mm,
and to encourage people to approach us, maybe go ahead and have that first instinct,
yeah,
but then be willing to approach us and acknowledge the loss, and then they can dip back out. But
yeah. So
something about doing that would be so beneficial.
let me ask you apropos of which, because this comes from my personal experience as well, and this is a real question. I'm not fishing for anything. You know, I happened to write a book with my son that became a bestseller back in the whatever it was when we wrote it in the 1990s after he became a Marine unexpectedly out of high school and then later, went to university and so forth. But anyway, in the context of that book, I was invited to a lot of events, and some of the events I was invited to was Marine parent events. Some of those Marine parent events were Gold Star moms who had lost their sons. So I was the guy whose son is in combat, so I'm scared shitless,
Yes.
but he's coming home so far. He's not dead, but everyone else in the room is a mother who is you. So
Yes.
I've had the experience two or three times where I am the only parent in a room. And then it's worse than that because my book is selling and it's about the Marines and they like it. They're inviting me to speak to them.
Ooh.
Would you say a few words? Well, what am I going to say? And it was a real journey. And I'm not saying I got it right or didn't get it right, but I'm just telling you, not only do I get what you mean, I get it from the other side.
I really appreciate
Because,
you sharing that, because I see how that could be the case. And
okay, so I'm asking you point blank, it's too late now, but what should have I said to them individually? Um, because I'm standing there and I'm someone they've invited, not to comfort them, but to be there and talk about the Marine Corps. But it's all gone bad for them. So it's like being invited to talk about parenting. You're using examples from your own children and grandchildren, as I would, but everybody in the room, every single one of their kids is dead. They've lost them all. That's
yes,
the context. And it flummoxed me and undid me. And I'm pretty good on my feet to come up with things to say. Well, not then. So I can't even remember how I stumbled around on what I said, but the experience really sticks with me. And so that part of your book really resonated. And now I'm asking you, when you meet someone who has lost a child or lost anyone, but particularly a parent who's lost a child, and particularly a mother who's lost a child or a son, and you did have a little of this in your book about the people who sort of said the right thing, but what is the right thing to forget said? What's the right thing to feel, first of all?
yes. I don't even believe that there's any right thing. And in fact, it might even be the right thing just to say that I don't have the right words. There are no words. There
Yeah.
aren't. Um, and I think it's more energetic. I think it's more about leaning toward and maybe even demonstrating with the touch of a hand or a hug.
Yeah.
Um, it really is that simple. It's thinking of you, particularly under these circumstances. I could see you saying, under these circumstances, to have me, it means so much, and
Mm.
I'm with you, or I'm,
Yeah,
just something that promotes connection instead of not distance and separation, but
absolutely.
connection.
Yeah, and not look the other way or duck into the other room because you're so uncomfortable.
Yeah, to be run away from is not something that's fun,
No.
but again, understandable, but not fun.
Yeah, and I love that idea of the contagion because it's not just misfortune of losing a child, it's all sorts of misfortune. We don't want to know people who are suffering the thing we fear.
No, no. And it's so interesting. I think that there is a call for this globally now, to just have an openness, an open-heartedness. This is one way that I'm attempting to embody my son because he had that.
Mm.
It's really sort of this willingness to pause and pay attention and bear
Yeah,
witness to whatever pain, because everywhere we turn, people are experiencing challenges of their own.
yeah. Hey, the next little section I've done the same thing. I have some quotes pulled from various parts of your book. I must be crazy because some are like from page 30 and others are from page 207. So you can see I read the book and I jumped around, but I put these ideas together and I hope you think I did justice to them. Okay, so my overall question to this little section, I'm going to read you three quotes, is how do we deal with loss? All right. One, there is healing to be found in allowing the sadness of missing him to enter. It feels like loyalty. It feels like love. We are so connected that he is part of me. I move through my pain more easily when I refrain from judging myself for it. Quote two, the toughest stuff of grief consists of regret, guilt, and pure pain. Grief has a mind of its own. When it comes, it hits hard, familiar, but still surprising in its power, descending as sharply as ever. Quote three, I like it when people ask me tough questions. I like going deep. It surprises me that most people I see don't ever ask how I'm feeling. I imagine it's too uncomfortable to talk about, and they think they are helping by not getting into it. But if my grief isn't speakable, I feel unseen. Quote four, I go back into the dark, familiar tunnel where I second guess myself as his mom. I get especially tripped up around the fact that I lost him just as I'd let go of the fears I'd harbored for as long as I could remember. Here comes the vice grip on what is left of my heart. There isn't any preparation for the experience of losing a child. So I pieced those together from various parts of your book. And I think they express, great depth of sorrow and a kind of a longing for it not to have happened. But at the same time, you know, those passages jumped out at me as very real in terms of not explaining you, but kind of going to the heart of what you were trying to say. They certainly said something to me. So maybe follow that through. And just my overarching question at the beginning of these little passages I read is how do we deal with loss?
Right. How do we? And I love the ones that you selected. And I think perhaps as a therapist and
Mm,
as someone who already had a spiritual foundation,
mm,
I was more amenable to the idea of surrendering to the feelings as they came. I mean, I couldn't have helped it.
yeah.
I was just consumed.
Mm,
But there was a faith that in moving through and softening into, like, letting those tears that I mean, I couldn't I didn't think that they'd ever stop. I'd
yeah.
never cried so many tears. And And they do stop, but then there's also this acceptance and peace around the fact that they
Mm,
will ebb and flow, that that is the nature of grief, that it,
mm.
that it will be conjured up at any given moment, oftentimes when you least expect it, you
Yeah.
know. And and so this sort of succumbing to that because it is direct testimony to the amount of love. And so I wouldn't change a thing. I would
Mm,
and still continue to love
mm,
him
mm.
uh, with my heart and soul.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's the sort of the answer, not to the loss, I guess answer is totally the wrong word, but the method of dealing with it is just to try to feel that love intensely.
I think so. And then there's so many other pieces to what I needed to do to take care of myself. I mean,
Mm.
grief has a physiological impact
Yeah,
and
when someone in the book tells you to take better care of yourself, or someone tells you that, I forget what passages it is in the book, but at some point in the book, it was like taking care of yourself becomes a thing, if I remember rightly.
yes, you're remembering correctly. And I think that that may have been from my therapist. And I think that there's some essential ingredients to um, and I don't even know if there's anything that makes moving through the grief journey less hard. I'm not
Yeah.
going to, but I will say that resourcing myself was essential. That
What
going
do you
to,
mean by resourcing yourself? Sorry.
I mean, seeing my therapist
Yeah,
regularly,
sure.
going to a specialized traumatic therapy healing, energy healing, seeking out mediums who could connect me to my son so I could begin to think in terms of the fact that his spirit lives on, which was essential for me to be able to survive this.
Mm,
um, some of those really fundamental self-care things like taking time off work so that I could
sure.
sleep, get enough sleep.
Yeah, yeah. And doing things so you could sleep. And that
Yeah,
has to do with, yeah. I just want to reintroduce you. Sally is the author of the book we're talking about, Reaching for Beautiful, a memoir of loving and losing a wild child. The wild child's name is Chris, and he died and drowned, went through the ice with three of his friends. And 9 years later, we're reading a book about what happened. It was, and Sally waited 7 years to write. I just want to make a general comment as a writer to someone who's written a first book about something very personal. And that is that, I know this is cliched, but the writing itself is a form of therapy, and it's not limited to you because you suffered a horror. This is what writing is. And I often, you know, deal with this when you write a memoir, particularly if parts of it are about people who didn't do very well by you. There's always this question of, for the ones who are still alive, what will they think about it? And am I recycling my life and trying to use it in some way? And I think people who haven't done this don't get the fact that you're talking about you want people to see you. We all want to be seen. And if you write, that's part of it. It's a cry to be seen. It's like, hey, this mattered. And I think that's what why you wrote your book. I'm not telling you putting words in your mouth, but I think it's why anybody writes anything, even not even fiction. I'd like to be seen. It's the same reason we do whatever we do in life. It's a very legitimate process. And of course, if we find some healing in that, other people find it in that too. And that's why they read. That's an off the top of my head comment.
absolutely. I did have a number of things that I hoped to achieve in writing, but I was really clear that if nothing else, when I decided to take my journal writing to my son to connect with him and
Yeah.
make it into a memoir, that it was also this opportunity to reflect on his life and really give an inside look at the grief I was feeling so that it healed me, so that
Yeah.
it was about my own healing. And writing will do that. And
Yeah.
then it's interesting that you point out the part about wanting to be seen because ultimately something really remarkable happened. It was in writing it with that objective, which is something
Mm.
that I've carried with me always, is this desire to it's sort of appearance versus like inside out. Inside out,
Sure.
I sort of experienced the fact that people weren't necessarily appreciating the depth of what I, was inside my heart.
Yeah.
Um, and wanting to get that out onto the page, that I appreciated that really what mattered most is that I know, that I see
Exactly.
myself, that I see me, and that I in turn honor Christopher and honor those that are grieving, hoping to help them feel a little less alone in
Yeah.
all of this,
Yeah. Let me
helping.
bring up something that's interesting to me, and then I'm going to dive into another part of your book here. The next section I've got is on parenting, and I have three quotes I want to read you, and then just talk to you about you yourself as a parent, your other children, and that goes back into your own childhood experiences of being parented. But before we get there, when it comes to grieving and loss and people ducking away from you because is this contagious? Um, I'm going to be 73 in August, and I've been together with Jeannie for a long time. And like I have three grown children and five grandchildren and so forth. So I kind of have done a big chunk of the arc of life. There are many fewer days ahead, no matter how you do the math, than behind. Um, there is a kind of a loss in that, like I've had a number of surgeries and Jeannie's had some too. And she just had another medical thing. And 3 years ago, she had a heart attack and a stent put in. And Jeannie and I refer to all these things that happen when you're older. You get up at night, pee a lot because your prostate's bigger now. There's a lot of little things and some big ones. And we have a term for all of them. And that is we say, oh, here comes another rehearsal for mortality.
Hmm.
And that's how we see ourselves now. A lot of what we're doing is a rehearsal for mortality. Getting older is no picnic, and we're just at the first taste of it in a way. We all live longer than we're supposed to in terms of our evolutionary construction. You were supposed to die in childbirth, and I was supposed to die when I was 30. You know what I mean? I mean,
Right,
that's how evolution designed us.
right,
All the modern medicine and the things we do now, nobody else in history has ever lived this long. I mean, even in the 1950s, the actuarial tables in Great Britain, for instance, where men died at 50, et cetera, which is a long preamble to say that there's another kind of turning away. As you get older, you are no longer seen in the same way that you were once seen. And in addition to which, you don't want mortality to be catching. So when you see a very frail old lady sit in the dermatology surgical ward at Mass General and she's getting some surgery, like my wife Jeannie was, who's a beautiful, vibrant 73-year-old who doesn't look like she's 73, she's still getting the attention. She's still getting attention Jeannie gets. But
right.
she's on the cusp of being that much older woman that people kind of look away from. It's like, they don't count anymore. They're already sort of dead, and you don't want to get too near because it might be catching. And you see young people, especially where all of our intergenerational connections have been broken. Kids are in school, young people are doing this, everybody's on their phone. So, what I want to ask you about is, as I get older and my wife gets older, and we keep having these rehearsals for mortality that will end in mortality itself. There's a kind of a grief at the passage of time, not because I'm afraid of death. I could care less, literally, of death for myself, but I am afraid of loss, and
Hmm.
you understand loss.
I do.
So let's pretend for a minute that this is a paying session and you can bill Ernie, my producer, for the next 10 minutes. What would you tell me? Because my real fear in this life is not my own wellness, it's loss. And your book hasn't helped me any in that way, in the sense that I feel the pain of loss because it's all too easy for me to imagine, whether it's a child or a grandchild or somebody I love, or Jeannie dies first, God forbid, whatever happens. As you get to my age, loss is no longer an abstract concept.
No, no,
Half my friends are dead.
right.
Three out of my five favorite people died before me, which has freaked me out. They were younger than me. What the hell?
Yeah.
Um, So at my age, loss is not like an abstract, oh, I just read a book about loss. This is where my head's at.
It's everywhere. There's so many layers and threads to this, and I really appreciate your raising it. I appreciate um, the fact that It's so interesting. I do think that having lost my son is different than having lost a number of other people.
Sure, absolutely.
Because they died in time, or they might have been suffering with a disease that I
Yeah,
wanted them to be free from that suffering.
yeah.
Um, and even, I have a friend who took her life at 50. Um, I Everyone goes, and there, I've come to think in terms of we all have sort of our life plan.
Mm,
I don't believe that Christopher was meant to be here forever.
yeah.
One of the things that I do try to take with me that is helpful in terms of how do we, when we when we're afraid of losing, uh,
Mm,
how where do we find comfort? Where do we
mm,
restore safety? Is that this all that we love deeply becomes a part of us? So
sure.
that Christopher, even though I do have the incredible despair around his absence of his physical presence,
Mm,
I feel him. He is a part of me. He gives me strength.
yeah,
And he, more so than even, my grandmother, Sally, who also is a source of strength,
sure.
but that um, we we're just here to continue to grow and evolve. We are not meant to be spirit of pain in this lifetime.
Mm,
The fact that we do love so greatly means we will feel that
yeah,
missing. We're
yeah,
not supposed to be sheltered from
yeah.
missing. We get to miss, but part of the solace is that they haven't left.
Mm,
And I really have come to believe that no, there's a guidance, that there's an energy, there's a power
mm,
that that gives me peace.
mm. Yeah, I'm going to move on to the next bit here, and we're parenting. My role as a mother is not all what I thought it would be. The part I'm good at is cheering for my children backstage behind the curtains. The part that tears me up inside is when I have to watch them struggle with their parts. They each have scripts I can't dictate. At this point, I don't know what to do since it's time to stop feeding them their lines. Okay, second passage. While Chris was in the Utah desert, I prayed and the desert sun would bake away his disease. And by disease, I'm presuming you're talking about his addiction.
Correct.
I consciously tried to leave behind all the desperate nights I'd spent trying to track him down, the fear I'd been carrying, and the times he pushed me away. And then another quote. I soon discovered we'd need to hire an educational consultant to determine the next step. This was an expensive and challenging proposition, especially given our experience with military school. We would need to take another big leap of faith that the consultant and the professionals she'd connect us to would come through. Joe and I each had a tough time relinquishing control over the process because now both of us were afraid. So that's sort of an encapsulation again of your journey as a parent. And of course, the backstage metaphor, you don't write the script, you're with them backstage, obviously is about more than simply a children's play. You're not writing your children's script. And then now you go through this challenge. So just talk about your personal experience as a parent, irrespective of the way Chris' life ends, although that's why you wrote the book. But you're a parent, you have children, you yourself were parented. What do you know about parenting now at your age and having gone through all this that you wouldn't know if you hadn't gone through all this?
I return to this concept of powerlessness and appreciating that everyone is on their own path, and they may be here for a short time, they may be here for a long time, but I've come to think in terms of we're just here to grow and learn and evolve and develop wisdom, and find ways to touch into all the love that is possible. And it's that simple. And if I am trying to control outcomes and push through and be um, doing everything right, so to speak. That's sort of an illusion. There's an illusion that if I force something, it's gonna and instead there needs to be more of a flow and an acceptance to that which is, and then that creates it makes me so much more available and present to my children to have the kind of relationship. I've got two living children. If I am driven by fear about the fact that any number of things could happen to them, then that will only create distance in the relationship. And we won't be able to seize those moments of joy. And so that's where it is.
Fear is a way of life. And you have a quote in here, I can't remember ever not being afraid. I can trace my fear back to childhood when my dad's presence could set alarms in my highly sensitive nervous system. Um, you talked about your father at the beginning of this, but how present is that with you now in terms of those fears, irrespective of the story that you've written in this book about Chris, loss, and addiction? That basically sense of childhood spent in fear of a father, and also what he might do and what he did do, but always that potential for things to come unhinged. Obviously, that's followed you. And you're still talking about it and thinking about it. I mean, these things don't just go away.
No, no, this does appear to be, and I do think that this happens, and I see it with my clients and really everyone I know, that we are repeatedly presented with, certain challenges and given every opportunity to move entirely through them, and we will keep being faced with challenges in our lives, and maybe until the point of
Mm.
exit, that support these objectives. But to let go of fear is absolutely something that I've been um, striving to do.
Yeah, easier said than done, though.
Oh, the hardest thing, especially when you have had experiences that, losing Christopher was the realization of one of my greatest fears.
Sure.
And but I also know that if I'm living in that and in a place of anticipation,
Yeah.
then I'm not present in the here and now.
Yeah, which obviously, too, in your role as a mother of two other kids, brings up how this impacted them. I don't mean how did they feel and all that stuff. I'm just talking about how did it impact the arc of parenting? Because, for instance, I have friends who have had maybe two or three children, and one of them is disabled or severely disabled or has an accident and is now disabled or has cancer, and now they're all at Boston or Philadelphia Children's Hospital night and day, and the other kids are at home with a babysitter. It's very hard to keep track of the children who were well. And how
So
did that
true.
work out for you?
I've devoted a lot of thinking to that as well, that Christopher took up a lot of air in the room when he was
Yeah,
here on Earth, and that um, in his death as well, he's had sort of a legendary status for many.
yeah, yeah,
And that's not easy, on behalf of my living children, who were very well acquainted with his imperfections.
yeah,
And so all I can do is all I can do to be very much available to them. And my
yeah,
daughter in particular, who was the middle child, you
yeah.
know,
It's tough
um,
anyway. Yeah,
tough anyway, in between two boys, with a lot of energy. She has been able to verbalize the fact that she felt like she got lost, and in some
yeah,
ways penalized for being a good girl.
yeah,
And so we really do everything in our power. She's getting married, and trust me when I say we're doing all that we can to celebrate her.
yeah, exactly. Well, it's tough. And she'll be your age someday, and then she'll be my age someday, God willing. And then she'll know that was hard for my mom because, easier said than done. I mean, your attention is what I mean, it's like to tell somebody, well, don't, stop feeling bad. Okay, well, good, good for you. But we don't dictate that. And it's hard to pay attention to the child who's
It's a
not
funny
doing the
thing when
suffering.
yes, when they start to appreciate that their parents are very human. And I've been very forthcoming about that, that
Yeah.
we're not superhuman.
Yeah, I would imagine you have been given that. I read the book. I sort of know where your head's at from that, at least. Um, so I'm going to sort of wind up by reading this, and we got about, let me look at my page of notes. We are a third of the way through my notes, so I didn't do that well, but I got through some
You
things.
did beautifully. I'm sure I went on too long.
No, no, it was me that went on too long. Believe me, I'm the one that goes on too long on this show because I get, you kind of live in your own head. Um, for as long as I'm alive, this is you in the book, I have no doubt that I will periodically be ambushed by an overpowering yearning. I will descend into an excruciating ache I couldn't have fathomed before my heart was struck. But I will do my best to welcome grief when it overtakes me, as it is an outlet for my affection and boundless love for my boy. And I think that's kind of actually, let me see, where does that come? Yeah, that does come from toward the end of your book. Um, and so it's an appropriate place for us to sort of wind this up. Let's talk about that a little bit because obviously this will never end for you. You'll be thinking about this on your own deathbed if you're given more than 10 seconds um, in your own finishing of your life and so forth. This will stick with you. Um, but on the other hand, you have moved by it. You're not sitting here crying. You're a testimony to the fact that time doesn't heal exactly, but it changes the immediacy and you found other ways to deal with it. But on the other hand, you're still gripped by that, aren't you, sometimes?
Yes, it does lighten over time. Um, all of my life's purpose and knowing that Christopher is by my side and
Mm,
encouraging me to do the work that I do in his honor, um, it does sort of there are these illustrations and they'll show grief stays the same, but then everything else grows around it. And
yeah.
so there is an adaptation that takes place, and I will always and forever have anticipate that I will be ambushed in those
Mm.
moments, and um, and I'm okay with that. I'm
Yeah.
okay.
Now, toward the end of your book, I think you list some things people can get in touch with for help on addiction and other stuff. When I sign off here, stay on for a minute and make sure that you talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, again for a couple of minutes, and talk to him about anything you want us to link to and help you promote in terms of people getting in touch with you or other resources. Because obviously, someone out there who's watching and listening to this now live or as a podcast or later on YouTube is going to want to contact you because they have shared, sadly, an experience like yours in some way, whether it's with addiction for themselves or a loved one or loss. Um, so we've probably touched some people today in this conversation who are going to want to follow up. So we will provide means of doing that if you'll provide Ernie with ways they can contact
Course,
you.
I hope to be able to connect to those folks
That
and
would be good.
to be available to them, um, and I hope they will read Reaching for Beautiful, whether they've lost a child or not.
Yes.
I'm
Yeah.
hoping that it has some little like glimmers of hope.
Yeah, and also it sadly ties in to all of our lives because we all are going to lose ourselves at some point and the people we love most. So, in terms of rehearsal for mortality, it's not like we none of us conduct this, and addiction too, because it's right there. I mean, this is ripped from the headlines.
That's right. That's right. It's everywhere, and you will know someone, you will have a family member or a friend who's
Yeah.
been touched by the loss of a child or certainly addiction.
Yeah, and we all tend to want to find an easy reason or blame, or if there's been this or that or the other. And of course, in our contemporary political moment, we're always looking to blame someone or do this or do that. But the fact of the matter is, this is the human condition.
It is indeed. It
Yeah,
is indeed.
yeah.
And
We're not very well put together. Evolution kind of screwed up. Um, this is a funny way to put it, but just our longevity timeline compared with our aspirations. The fact that my life is very ill matched with how long I'd like to be around for everybody. All this is the human condition, isn't it?
It really is. We just, all we can do is aspire in this day,
Yeah.
truly seize the day and bring ourselves a lot of compassion
Hmm.
for being here, putting one foot in front of the other as
Yeah.
humans.
Yeah.
Not an
Well,
easy,
just like you're functioning now, focusing on your daughter's wedding coming up.
right, right.
And
Reaching for that,
yeah,
rising above.
yeah. And that's your answer
It
to
is.
suffering. I mean, this is where you make your stand on being a human being to the people around you. And that's it. That's all we've got.
That's right. That's right.
Good. Well, this has been great. And I would encourage people to read your book. We will post it everywhere where we've got this Reaching for Beautiful, a memoir of loving and losing a wild child. And in it also something very, very poignant on the whole issue of addiction and then this life cut short. So, Sally, you did a good job, and I thank you for being my guest today.
Oh, Frank, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you about all of this.
Good. And I have two-thirds of my quotes are unasked because we went deep instead of too wide, but we covered
I
a lot.
appreciate depth so much. I really do. It just is the kind of conversation that I want to be able to have.
Good. Well, when you have more podcasts, tell them to prepare better.
You did beautifully. Um,
Say, I talked to a guy who didn't skim, he actually read.
yeah, no, I mean, that means so much to me. Thank you for all of your thoughtfulness with each of the questions and all
Yeah,
the
well, and literally, I mean this from my heart. Much love to you and your family,
thank
and
you and
keep doing
yours.
what you're doing. Keep talking to people. Your clients are lucky. You have a lovely presence.
Thank you so much for that, Frank.
Talk soon.
Will do.
Talk to Ernie now.
I
Bye.
will. Okay, bye-bye.